Right, good afternoon everyone, welcome to this Methods What Is session. My name is Jerome Group. I'm actually from English and American Studies, but I head up Art Methods at Manchester, which is the kind of arts version of Methods. Our website is now live and you can book onto certain things if you wish to. We're running all kinds of workshops from kind of technical, theoretical stuff. We've also got some things going on about outreach, using narrative techniques to sell your work to filmmakers, social responsibility. So if you want to sign up for those, they are open to you. The website is artmethods.manchester.ac.uk, and you can follow our Twitter account should you wish to do such things, or you can blog, or you can get involved with things that happen there. It's just more a kind of companion to Methods at Manchester, but it's there to augment your education. So come along. Today, What is Oral History will be led by Professor Penny Summerfield from the History Department, and I shall leave it to her to tell you what she's going to do.
Right, thank you very much, Jerome. Right, well, I want to introduce oral history to you now. Yeah, I've passed around a sheet with a few references on it, because I haven't actually put the references on the PowerPoint, but I will be referring to various oral historians as I go along, and other theorists.
Oh, I should say that your PowerPoint is on the Methods website, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, so this PowerPoint is on the resources section of the Methods website, so you don't have to scribble everything.
No, indeed. That's right. Okay, well, the American oral historian Ronald Grele defined oral history in 1972 as the interviewing of eyewitness participants in the events of the past for the purposes of historical reconstruction. And this sounds like a handy definition, but things have moved on since 1972, and the field of oral history has expanded, the academic respectability of the method has increased, and the uses of oral history have proliferated. And taking Grele's definition phrase by phrase, interviewing is certainly what oral historians do. And typically they record their interviews, which isn't in the definition but is important to sort of note. They transcribe them so that there's a text, a written record, as well as an oral record, and archive them so that oral history interviews can be used by other researchers. And out of all that, historical reconstruction is certainly what oral historians do with interviews. The part of Grele's definition, which 40 years long, no longer seems quite to describe the method adequately, is the concept of eyewitness participants in the events of the past. Eyewitness participants. At the time Grele was writing, US and British oral historians mostly identified the events that they were interested in and sought witnesses, eyewitnesses to those things. And they were preoccupied with kind of certain features of the material they got. They were interested in the accuracy of information, and the shift that's occurred is towards greater interest in the narratives and the construction of memory. So oral history today is less of a quest for objective eyewitness accounts, and more of an interest so less of an interest in data for interpretation, and more of an interest in the way in which oral accounts give access to experience, to subjectivity, and to the historical imagination. So the questions British oral historians asked back in the 70s and 80s were sort of typically, what did interviewees' accounts tell us about such things as historical phenomena such as agricultural practices, or schooling, or industrial work, or strikes, or motherhood? These days, of course, such topics are still of interest, but oral historians typically include questions like, well, how do interviewees construct themselves through their narratives of experience? How do personal experience and public histories interact in the production of memory stories? As Grele himself recently put it in some online reflections, I googled Ronald Grele, and up came a YouTube site with Ronald Grele talking for about 10 minutes. So something you could do if you wanted to. But he actually said there's been a shift from concern with data to concern with text. So this intellectual shift is important when trying to explain what is oral history now. All the same, I don't think it should be overstated. What I'm saying is I think it's very important to understand it, but not to overstate it. One approach, the information, the data, the interpretation approach, wasn't overthrown by the narrative's construction of memory, access to subjectivity approach. So, and one approach wasn't wrong and the other right. They coexist with each other and with other approaches with longer roots, such as the use of oral history to collect folklore, for example. Oral history is used as a research method in different ways and with different emphases on this spectrum from data to text by an increasingly wide range of disciplines within academia and a huge variety of organisations outside academia, from schools, community groups, voluntary organisations, hospitals, you name it. Okay, so I want to say more about the various different approaches to oral history, and also I want at the end to spend a little bit of time, if there is time, on how it's done, some sort of practicalities. So I've organised today's presentation under 4 headings: recovery history, the interview dynamics, the relationship between culture and memory, and as I say, some of the practicalities, some ethics and some protocols of oral history interviewing. And I'm going to illustrate what I say with examples from some of my own projects which have been on various different aspects of the Second World War, but also I'll be referring to other oral historians' projects. Okay, so to start with the idea of recovery history. The purpose of oral history as it developed in Britain from the late 60s was radical. As the British oral historian Paul Thompson wrote, the main influence in Britain was the new social history movement, which challenged the focus of mainstream history on political elites and economic trends. The oral history movement demanded a reorientation of history, an approach to history which would end the neglect of the ordinary person. And oral historians insisted that if records about the ordinary person didn't seem to exist, then they'd have to be created using the new technology of the portable tape recorder. And the objective was to recover histories that would otherwise be lost, hence the term recovery history. And this approach was enthusiastically taken up by historians of the labour movement, by feminist historians, by historians of members of ethnic minorities. And projects recovered the history of working class women in industrial Lancashire, children's experiences in Edwardian classrooms, and the history of Caribbean migrants to Britain, just to give 3 examples. And I think on the sheet of references that are handed round, in the bottom section, there are examples of histories based on oral history. So the radical intention was to give a voice to the voiceless, to raise consciousness, to empower those for whom there was now a place in history. Now, oral historians back in the late 60s, 70s, 80s had to fight for recognition of the method. Criticisms included the accusation that oral history was unreliable because of the fallibility of memory, and also that it was invalid because it wasn't representative. On the first of these, the distinguished radical historian Eric Hobsbawm, some of you may have heard of, decried oral history on the grounds that memory couldn't be a reliable medium for historical research. So obviously oral historians leapt to the defence of the new method, and they responded that all memory is not unreliable all the time. So, for example, Trevor Lummis argued that short-term memory declines with age, so it becomes difficult to remember what happened yesterday, but long-term memory often improves. And Paul Thompson added that the reliability of memory actually varies according to the things being remembered. Specific things like dates and one-off events are often hard for people to remember. Often repeated routines like work routines or domestic routines and incidents of personal importance are recalled even at a vast difference in time. As far as representativeness is concerned, the social science traditions in which oral history developed emphasise the importance of the representative sample as the basis for generalisation from data. And oral historians of the early phase, the 70s, the 80s, who undertook projects, strove for representativeness, and that included Paul Thompson, really a founding father of modern oral history in Britain. So they strove to comply with the demands of social science, but they faced two difficulties. One concerned the sample and the other concerned the questionnaire. It's hard to obtain a statistically representative sample of the population in the past because of difficulties of tracing all those who, say, lived in a particular place in 1940, say, and because of the problems of differential survival rates since that time, and also because of dependence on volunteers prepared not just to answer questions, but to construct narratives. And that's linked to another issue. Oral history is dialogic. It's the product of a dialogue, a conversation between the interviewer and the interviewee. It's a conversation in which the oral historian seeks to stimulate the interviewee to compose memory stories about themselves in the past. So the structured interview based on standard questionnaires isn't appropriate for the oral history interview. It simply isn't a box-ticking exercise. Even though oral historians do typically take a schedule of questions to an interview, they ask follow-up questions, they prompt their interviewees to elaborate and explain what they mean. Different interviewees understand the same questions in different ways, and their answers vary in length, complexity, and ambiguity. So, responses aren't directly comparable. The interests of the interviewer in a particular subject about which they know something and want to find out more are constantly being modified by the preoccupations of the interviewee with aspects of the past which are unknown to the interviewer, and which the dialogue can enable him or her to discover. And discovery and changing the historical agenda is at the heart of oral history. Interviewees often remember things that surprise their interviewers. Oral historians test the validity of such evidence, sort of less to cast doubt on whether they're telling the truth than to find out whether this is an opportunity to revise the received historical account. How do oral historians test the validity? Well, by seeking out other sources, either similar ones such as other oral history interviews, or different ones such as documentary evidence to corroborate testimonies. And putting questions derived from oral history to other primary sources frequently brings to light evidence that's been overlooked or distrusted, precisely because it's unexpected. So, an example from one of my projects. Oral history provided evidence that in the Second World War, women joined the Home Guard, the British Defence Force, the volunteer Defence Force. And not only that they joined the Home Guard, but that they learned to use weapons within the Home Guard, in spite of an official ban on them doing so. That's a photograph which once alerted to the possibility that maybe women were actually recruited by Home Guard members and did actually learn to shoot in spite of an official ban. I found in the archives. Okay, and the photograph shows a civilian woman learning to use a Lee-Enfield rifle and being taught by a member of the Home Guard, identifiable by his cap badge. So, oral history enables us to recover lost aspects of history and to ask historiographical and theoretical questions about why that particular element has been lost. So oral history as recovery history is valuable and important, and not just for giving a voice to the voiceless, but also for reorienting historical research. So in short, there's a richness to oral history which goes beyond the idea that its aim is to record the accounts of eyewitness participants in the events of the past, to repeat Ron Grele's definition. And the richness derives both from evidence of and information about what happened to people in the past, which, as I said, is often simply not recoverable by other means. And it's also derived from the way in which interviewees remember and express their experience. The telling of experience is, according to feminist theorist Joan W. Scott and also Judith Butler, the means by which subjects constitute themselves. Subjectivity is expressed in and constructed through the language of an interchange in an oral history interview. So rather than seeing the subjectivity of oral history as a problem sort of standing in the way of the collection of objective data, oral historians increasingly see oral history as providing a special opportunity for the exploration of the historical subject. And recognising that oral history is about subjectivity points to our next two issues, the dynamics of the interview and the relationship of culture to memory. Okay, so let's have a look at interview dynamics. Gerontologists, such as Peter Coleman, whose work's on your reading list, suggest that the process of life review occurs in reminiscence in old age. And this typically involves several features: looking back questioningly over a life to gauge its value, so retrospective questioning. Secondly, the search for self-affirmation. And thirdly, comparisons of the self with other individuals or of the younger self with the older self. And this kind of life review is central to other types of autobiographical practice too, such as the memoir. So if you pick up any memoir and think about these features, you can find them there. Oral history interviews offer scope to explore life review in order to understand more about the subject and their place in history. Historians deepen and build understanding of the individual by eliciting and studying their subjective assessments of the value of their life, the sources of affirmation and its opposite, and continuities and contradictions in their comparisons with others and with their younger selves. Now, a related aspect of the dynamics of the interview is composure. And this term has been used by Graham Dawson, Alistair Thompson and others to indicate a dual process at work in an interview. On the one hand, there's the composition of the narrative that the interviewee tells, and on the other, there's the achievement of composure in the sense of psychic equilibrium through the process of telling. And these are the vehicles for the expression and construction of subjectivity. Now, oral history interviewees compose their narratives through a variety of narrative forms. Some of the narrative forms people use when they're talking about their lives, and sometimes, they're fairly consistent in the use of the narrative forms that they deploy, such as the fairy tale, in which fate governs life, or the epic, in which life involves overcoming obstacles and striving towards a desired goal. The theorist Marie-Françoise Chanfreau-Duchet argues that such narrative strategies communicate something about how the narrator sees herself or himself in relation to social structures and processes. They also reveal something about the cultural tropes at the disposal of the narrator. But often things aren't that clear-cut. A narrator often combines several narrative forms, the usage depending on what aspects of their lives they're talking about. And many narrators use anecdotes. Often the narrative of a life is basically a succession of anecdotes strung together to form an account. Now, anecdotal evidence is often dismissed in social science as unrepresentative and unreliable. It's kind of a term of abuse very often. But attention to the anecdote as a narrative form reclaims its place in research. What is an anecdote? Well, it's usually complete in itself. It's often told with humour or irony, quite often has a punchline or some kind of final reflection emphasising the narrator's intended meaning. So an anecdote kind of says it all in the sense of summing up the meaning of an episode and of a set of feelings and relationships. Now at this point I'm hoping to be able to play an extract, because I think it's time you heard some oral history. So this is an extract from an interview with a woman who joined the Home Guard, and she's talking about actually the phase before she joined the Home Guard, when the Second World was the early stages of the Second World War, and her father was concerned that she and her mother would be able to defend themselves in the case of invasion. So let's see if we can hear Caitlin Wells. She says, "Well, anyway, I remember when the war started. My father had his revolver from, I suppose, I don't know whether it was from India or from the 1418 war. But he had this, was it a Webley? A big revolver with 6 bullets that go in a valve. He would take me down on the tennis court to shoot at some tin cans, you know, because so that my mother and I could defend ourselves if the Germans landed, you know. And we were taking pot shots at these tin cans. And of course, the terrific bang, you know, when it went off, it was a very loud, and somebody rang the police to report that the Germans had landed, you know. The Germans were attacking in Steinmar. Parachutists had arrived, you know. And the next thing we knew was, I don't know if it was the police or an army came, and it was very embarrassing, really. But my father was advised not to do it, you know. It was funny, really, when you think about it. I can't do her lovely Cumbrian accent, but there we are. So, I mean, her oral history interview as a whole really did continue with a succession of anecdotes, mostly about her father and the Home Guard, sometimes with herself in them, but very often her kind of observations of what was going on. In this one, she was personally involved. She was a player, really, in her father's serious game. And the anecdote is partly about the unusual phenomenon of a young woman learning to shoot because of the wartime threat of invasion. But it's actually largely about her father's position. Elsewhere, she explains that he was a bank manager, he was a pillar of the community, but he's in a sense being compromised by his over-enthusiasm to teach his daughter to defend herself, which involves using weapons in a war situation when you really weren't meant to start shooting off revolvers in your back garden. And as I say, Caitlin Wells's later anecdotes kind of establish her largely as an observer, able to draw lessons from the events and characters of the time, but a sort of style which tells us that she, on the whole, didn't feel herself to have been a direct participant who could produce a coherent narrative focused on herself, and in particular that, as well as some of the humorous aspects of the war, the heroic aspects of the war lodged in a male world, her father's world, of defence secrets and weaponry, rather than her own world, which was more a world of stoic coping. Anyway, moving on, the second meaning of the term composure. Oh, there she is. I thought you'd like to see her. I was hoping you'd have heard her, but anyway, that's how she looked at the time. The second meaning of composure, used in relation to oral history, refers to the personal gains derived from composing a personal narrative. The sociolinguist Charlotte Lind argues that the achievement of integration is a common outcome of telling life stories. And the reconstruction of a past in a dialogue with an interviewer frequently involves the production of a narrative that satisfies the teller. And the process facilitates his or her personal composure, the achievement by the narrator of personal equilibrium. And Peter Coleman has observed that a particular type of reminiscence in which some elderly people engage consists of a sort of achievement of self-affirmation through the repetition of particular stories that produce that feel-good factor. And historians such as Alistair Thompson and Alessandro Portelli have argued that inaccuracies in accounts and elisions and particular emphases can sometimes be explained by the desire for composure. So an example that comes from Alistair Thompson's work concerns the case of a man called Percy Bird, who gave an account of his reasons for joining the Anzac Army, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, in 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, which involved him redrawing the map of Melbourne. He claimed to have seen a German battleship in the harbour from the train, and if you actually look at a map of Melbourne, it's completely impossible to see the harbour from the train. So it was an inaccuracy, it was wrong. But on the other hand, Al Thompson uses that example to show that in fact the inaccuracy was an integral part of Percy Bird's explanation for recruitment, and it was integral to his own achievement of composure through the story about joining up and fighting patriotically in World War I that he was telling. Okay, so Alistair Thompson and also Alessandro Portelli point to truths beyond the facts in such cases. The uncertainties and discoveries of life review are also present in the interchange, and at times they put composure at risk. While some interviewees experience interviews as an enjoyable trip down memory lane, to use a cliche, through which they can kind of reclaim their past, others are preoccupied with the dangers of losing their pasts, or they're affected by a strong sense of discontinuity. Caitlin Wells, who I introduced you to just now, she said, when I look back on it, it all seems so long ago, as though it never really happened, as though it probably happened to somebody else, really, more than me. So life review, in fact, didn't give Caitlin a comfortable sense of coherent identity. It emphasised a disjuncture between her elderly self and her younger self. The interview, in fact, was conducive to discomposure in her case rather than composure. The achievement of composure by an interviewee depends in part, though not entirely, but in part, on the audience to whom he or she is speaking. Research on women's wartime memories indicates that women have commonly experienced disbelief or dismissal when speaking to local audiences, family audiences, about experiences that transgress accepted norms. And women's wartime roles often fall into that category. In a sense, that kind of disbelief or dismissal on the part of audiences involves the failure of the wider society to appreciate the significance of aspects of the past and a process perhaps of collective forgetting. And Caitlin Wells, again, was no exception. She spoke of her habitual silence about her membership of the Home Guard. She said, I keep quiet about it because I think people would just laugh, and say, what, women in the Home Guard? Oral history interviews, though, give subjects the opportunity to break such self-enforced silences and in a sense, to overcome the tragedy of losing their pasts. and how far this goes depends in part on the rapport between interviewer and interviewee. Oral history interviews are usually arranged in a spirit of friendly cooperation. They commonly involve the interviewer visiting the interviewee in their own home and being received into kind of a house or a room that's been made comfortable, that's been tidied, and so on. Often there are refreshments laid on. So, given the unwritten deal between interviewer and interviewee, usually the relationship continues in a positive kind of way. The receptive audience that the interviewer provides for the narrator's reminiscences is usually sufficient to prevent differences of age, education, social class, gender, race, politics, etc. from inhibiting the interview. Even the disconcerting occasions when that's not the case are opportunities for the oral historian to learn something about the narrator and perhaps also about themselves. And oral historians have documented cases of uncomfortable interviews where the normal kind of coziness and rapport hasn't been established. The concepts of composure and discomposure make expectations that oral history will simply empower the subject, though, seem rather glib. And remember that, that giving a voice to the voiceless and the idea of empowerment that goes along with that was one of the main aims of oral history when Paul Thompson was writing about it first in the 1970s. Composure or integration is, as numerous commentators have observed, often the objective of the life storyteller, but discomposure is a possible and even likely outcome. And it raises issues that remain unresolved among oral historians and which they debate about the proximity of the interview to a therapeutic session, as well as about the nature of the skills required in anybody undertaking oral history interviews. I want to move now onto culture and memory. And one of the criticisms made of recovery history is that oral historians often rather naively regard what their interviewees say as a kind of window on the past. They undertake corroborative research to establish the reliability of the witness, but then they treat the accounts of experiences as kind of unmediated and authentic. And there are clearly problems with that. Memory interacts with subsequent experience and with ideological and cultural representations of both the present and the past. So accounts of the past are never pure recall of life as it was. Post-structuralist historians, such as Joan W. Scott, have pointed out that accounts of experience can't give direct access to social reality because we can't remember outside the language and discourses in which we make sense of our lives. So, for example, many accounts of the past are imbued with nostalgia. In oral histories of the Second World War, this is often expressed, this kind of nostalgia is often expressed through comparisons between present day, the supposed greedy individualism of the present, and how things supposedly were in the Second World War, when there was an unselfish community spirit. And the idea of that community spirit, of national unity, of all pulling together, was a cultural and ideological phenomenon. It was a central part of wartime propaganda, and it's been a feature of accounts of World War II since. It's, if you like, become a paradigm through which to see Britain in the Second World War, and that informs recall. But does that mean that such memories are useless for the historian? Well, an attempt to scrape off the influence of cultural constructs like that one to get at the underlying historical truths is clearly impossible. It wouldn't work, it wouldn't do it. So should you then give up on the mission of oral history to place personal experience at the heart of history? Perhaps you should only study the ideological and cultural constructions, the discourses that shape consciousness and behaviour? Or should one focus on what memories tell us about the present? It's another possibility, through a study of the way in which popular memories are constructed and reconstructed as part of a contemporary consciousness. Both of those are possibilities, but both take the focus away from the individual's part in history. Another possibility is to accept that oral history taps mediated memory, and that the mediation is as much a part of the history one is studying as the memories themselves. So, by mediation I mean that education, religion, politics, local and family traditions, public culture, and so on all influence the way the past is remembered and interpreted. And these are historical phenomena, and the historian can study their interrelation with memory and recall. And the Italian historians, Luisa Passerini and Alessandro Portelli, really kind of urge this approach. They emphasise that the interaction of ideology and collective memory with personal accounts shapes those accounts, and that interaction itself needs to be the subject of study. Passerini's special contribution was to identify silences in the memories of members of the Italian labour movement about the years of fascist dictatorship of the 1920s and 30s. She recorded many members of the labour movement and found their accounts hopped from pre-1922, when Mussolini came to power, to the years of resistance in the Second World War, between 1943 and 45. And her conclusion was that her interviewees had unconsciously buried the years in between, when their agency as members of the labour movement was undermined by the dominance of fascism, and they had to make uncomfortable compromises. Al Thompson and other British oral historians, including myself, have stressed the possibilities of exploring a relationship between popular culture and personal memory. For example, returning to nostalgia for World War II, it's possible both to study the construction and promotion of the idea of wartime national unity and community spirit, and to probe this idea with interviewees to elicit personal, specific memories that both support and contradict it. Important to this endeavour is the idea of the cultural circuit. According to this concept, locally told individual life stories are picked up, developed and portrayed in a generalised form in popular culture, including, for example, in film, television, fiction and newspapers. As a result, the meaning of experiences of, say, the Second World War become crystallised in a popular and general form of this part of the past. Then local and personal accounts subsequently use elements of this generalised form in recalling personal pasts. It becomes difficult to speak outside it. An example is the construction of the Home Guard in the television series Dad's Army, which itself was based in part on personal memories. The script writers selected comic stories and they embroidered them. And the success of the series from 1968 to 77, and in repeat subsequently, give it considerable purchase on the popular imagination. Interviewees, men and women in my project on the Home Guard, spontaneously referred to Dad's Army, and many used it as a frame for their recollections, even when they criticised it for misrepresenting the Home Guard in their own experience. Okay, so I want just to carry on very briefly now with a few remarks about ethics and protocols, and this is to change gear a bit now. The oral history projects are undertaken within a broadly agreed set of parameters, and there are quite a few guides to those parameters. Questions in an oral history interview need to be open, not closed, simple, not complex, and to invite reflection, to ask why something happened, what the interviewee felt about it, rather than just what happened then. Interviewees need to be treated with respect and attention to their well-being, so follow-up is important, the thank you letter, and possibly the follow-up phone call to check if the interview is all right. And if an interview, as they often are, has been quite stressful for the interviewee, it's quite a good idea to have at hand contact details of at least, a counsellor, or at least knowledge of advice, like you can perhaps see your GP and your GP can refer you to a counsellor. Some oral historians return a copy of the interview or the transcript to the interviewee. Some arrange meetings of all their interviewees so as to involve the interviewees as participants, sort of striving for a kind of shared authority within the project. Then in law, the interviewee's words in an interview belong to them. Copyright law says their words belong to them. So oral historians ask interviewees to sign a release form granting the interviewer and project team the right to use the recording for their own purposes, which hopefully will have been explained to the interviewee beforehand. So this is just an example from the Home Guard project. This is to certify that I give permission for the transcript from my interview to be quoted and copies of my photographs and documents to be published and used for teaching purposes. I understand that the material will be used by myself as part of my research, and that it may be archived in a library archive where other researchers will have access to it. And I accept the above arrangement, and I do or do not wish my name to be used in any publication arising from the research. And that issue of anonymity is quite an interesting one and raises quite a few issues. Some interviewees do prefer anonymity, but of course there's a contradiction there. If the aim of oral history has been to put ordinary people back into history, then to take away their name again, in a sense, conceals them from history. But I suppose, if nothing else, their experiences and their construction of their experiences are there in history, in published history. It's important to have good quality recordings. There's a recorder here which looks very fancy, which is recording this talk, but I'm currently using this Sony, I'm advertising, Sony linear PCM recorder, PCM M10. It's really good, I really like it. Nice and small, easy to use. I use, and lots of oral historians prefer, external microphones, so little tie-clip microphones, to get a clearer recording. And clarity of recording, quality of recording is important whatever you're going to do with it. I mean, if it's going to be archived, if you want to transcribe it, the quality is really very important. Transcription, most oral historians think it is very important to produce a text for study as well as to listen to the recording. The orality is important, but so too it's important to have a transcript. Transcription is a time-consuming business. The 5-to-1 there refers to 5 hours of transcribing to 1 hour of tape. It's a tough one. There are some, it's possible to pay transcribers, that's one possibility, to do the job. It's also, if you're a student thinking of using oral history, many students find actually careful listening and summarising the interview with clear indications of how you can access the different sections that you've noted down works very well. Without, then you can transcribe in detail perhaps certain key bits of the interview without having to transcribe absolutely everything. Yes, summaries. So, to conclude, oral history is a complex methodology, but it's an exciting and developing one, and it has a very important role to play in recovering the past and also actually in expanding the meaning of history. So that's where I end.